You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. The worst drought in America for more than half a century and poor crops from the Black Sea breadbasket have both sent grain prices to record highs, raising the alarm over a potential repeat of the 2007-8 food crisis. The UN Food and Agricultural Organization is urging countries now to review their biofuel mandates and is warning against panic buying and restrictions on exports. It added that world cereal stocks would fall sharply, down 6% from its July forecast. Earlier today, Russian Deputy Agricultural Minister Ilya Shestakov said G20 countries would hold a rapid response meeting on the grain market next month. So, is the world on the brink of a new global food crisis? And what will the impact be if the cost of food continues to rise? Joining me in the studio is Robert Bailey, a Senior Research Fellow, Energy, Environment and Resources at Chatham House, Dr. Benny Pizer, Director of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, and James Hartfield, a lecturer and journalist in economic regeneration. And on the telephone, Guy Gavin, the Chief Arable Advisor for the National Farmers Union in the UK. James Hartfield, start with you. You've been writing about the environment for many years. What picture would you paint of the current situation?
It's obviously a problem in America, and the United Nations have made this warning, so we should take it seriously. I think the broad picture is not a disaster, or shouldn't be a disaster. However, we have to get used to the idea that particularly China and India have moved their economies away from agriculture towards industry, and that will put a greater demand on food worldwide.
Robert Bailey, you're from Chatham House. What would you say is the current picture of the world food industry, and what crisis does it face?
Well, we're currently in a period of very tightly balanced supply and demand. As we've just heard, demand is continually increasing, primarily due to economic development in emerging economies and the increasing use of biofuels, particularly in the US and the EU. But what we're not seeing is production keeping pace with it. So globally, cereal yields have started to flatline, despite the fact that demand is continuing to increase. So this means that markets are very tightly balanced, prices get very volatile in these situations, and stocks, the amount of food that we're keeping in reserve, they are now very low. So we don't have the stocks up our sleeves to dip into when we see a significant shock, such as the drought that we're seeing in the US at the moment. So at the moment, we're in a situation where we can expect food prices to remain very volatile for the foreseeable future.
Dr. Benny Pizer, what impact is this current situation having on the price of food?
Of course, the world can deal with these short-term price rises. What the world would struggle with is if the price rises were to continue. Most of the problems in food policy and food security is policy-driven. We already heard about biofuels. About 30% of all corn in the US is produced simply for renewable energy generation. So there is a third of the production taken away out of the food cycle. That is something that urgently needs to be reconsidered. I think it's a complete amoral and uneconomic and environmentally destructive policy that only serves a few vested interests. And the other issue in terms of long-term food security is another green controversy is, of course, we now have new technologies and genetically modified crops that can withstand droughts. And the problem is that a lot of these technologies are available but are either banned or not used because of environmental objections. So there are really solutions to a lot of the problems, but they need to be implemented.
To come back to you, please, Robert, what do you think about biofuels instead of crops? Is it ethically immoral, like Benny says?
I think as a policy, it's almost now impossible to justify. Certainly on the base of a policy to reduce emissions, biofuels have been largely discredited. A number of analyses have now come forward showing that because increasing cropland expansion to grow biofuels leads to overall expansion of agriculture into high carbon stock areas like rainforests, wetlands, for example, the emissions from this process actually outweigh any of the benefits you could hope to get from biofuels. There's a whole suite of analyses now from very credible, impartial institutes like the World Bank, the FAO, the IMF, demonstrating a very clear link between biofuel mandates and food price volatility. Estimates suggest that in the 2008 food price spike, for example, biofuels probably accounted for about 30% of the price spike on that occasion. So I think there's a very clear case for re-examining these policies in the light of current food price volatility. The real problem, as Benny said, is the sectoral interests that have organised around biofuel policies. Really what these policies are about are a new means of providing support to agricultural lobbies, primarily the Corn Belt in the US and rapeseed oil farmers in the European Union. And we know from history that these are extremely effective interest groups. The fact that we pay $250 billion a year in agricultural subsidies in the developed world to farmers should tell us how effectively organised these sectoral interests are. So this is the real challenge that we face, is in actually creating the political space for governments to get rid of biofuel support at a very difficult time.
Why was a policy of growing biofuels so popular in the first place?
Well,
James?
It was confusing. I think the public were sold an environmental solution, but probably the policymakers were really concerned with energy security policy. And also, we need to take into account that certainly in Europe and America, for nearly 20, 25 years now, the basic policy has been to reduce production. We had an overproduction problem in agriculture, and it was very difficult to undo for policy reasons, and it took a long time to undo it. And governments have been working to get farmers out of food production. Now, unfortunately, we need to turn that ship around again, because having over many years, having succeeded in stopping the overproduction of food, now we have food shortages, and we need to reverse some of those policies.
Robert Bailey.
I mean, that hits the nail on the head. We've had 2 decades up until now of declining food prices in real terms as a result of agricultural subsidies which have been paying farmers to overproduce. And rich country governments have been looking for a way out of this problem. And the solution that they came up with was biofuels. So we've got one set of subsidies which causes farmers to overproduce and leads to deflation in food prices. What's the solution? We'll come up with another set of subsidies which push up food prices, and hopefully the two will kind of compensate. And it just doesn't make any sense. We've really got to take a very close and careful look about the mechanisms that we're using to support agriculture at the moment, because none of this is making sense. Benny
Pizer, you were sniggering then.
Agree more. I mean, the biggest problem with food security and shortages and policies is man-made, is government. The governments think they know best. So they come up with all these fantastic subsidy proposals. And as it turns out, very often there are unintended consequences with all these schemes. So inherently, there is no food crisis. The food crisis we are facing are basically as a result of flawed policies. Even in countries like China and India, never mind Zimbabwe, which used to be one of the most fertile countries of Africa, and now is a basket case because of what happened in Zimbabwe. There is no inherent natural limit to feed the growing population. And so the challenge I see is a policy challenge, is to come up with policies that actually incentivize new and cost-effective agriculture that can provide food at a reasonable price to the growing population. I don't see why that can't happen. But there are the vested interests that want to keep the subsidies. They want to keep whatever they have. They don't want to give that up. The European farmers are spoiled, rotten, as we just heard. And all this needs to be reconsidered because some people are suffering as a result.
So we have a default in the policies made by government, but we also have a drought in the US. What impact is this having on, say, Southeast Asia, James?
Well, I think Southeast Asia is naturally looking elsewhere because this is their chance, and they must do what they're doing, which is to reorient their economies towards industry. The alternative is to stay where they were, which was very unfortunate and unhappy circumstance. And I don't think we can look to Southeast Asia to resolve these problems. I think Southeast Asia is already carrying the burden of boosting a lot of the world economy through its increased industrial production. We need to make sure that the rest of the world accommodates the fact that these are increasingly industrial countries rather than agricultural countries. And I think one of the first things we need to do is to take the chains off production in agriculture in the West.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Joining me for today's discussion on food security is Robert Bailey, Senior Researcher Fellow at Chatham House, Dr. Benny Pizer, Director of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, James Hartland, who's a lecturer in economic regeneration and a journalist, and on the telephone, Guy Gagan, the Chief Arable Advisor for the National Farmers Union in the UK. What would you say needs to be done in terms of ensuring food security?
Well, one of the major steps that really ought to have been tackled earlier on, and I think more and more people are realising in positions of authority that something needs to be done about agricultural research, leaving it up to the market, as was popular sort of in the 1980s and 1990s when production was actually a problem. Certainly in Europe it was considered a difficulty that had to be overcome instead of a difficulty that meant people were not getting sufficient food. Agricultural research was then reduced significantly, certainly public research. So the only people left doing agricultural research were global corporations, which then attract a certain amount of criticism from some elements. And as the government's moved away, the level of productivity increases has declined, and farmers are left, along with scientists, to respond by reducing production. This is what they did up until 2007. Since then, we've had some price spikes. We've had 3 price spikes since then, and I would argue that biofuels have been actually quite useful in supporting agricultural incomes and keeping farmers investing in production during the peaks and troughs as well. More importantly, the troughs from the farmer's point of view, because otherwise they would have continued to retrench and spend less money on innovation and spread their costs, become more extensive and produce less. We would have been actually in a much more vulnerable position now, suffering droughts in certain parts of the world, if we didn't have the production base there in the first place at all.
Dr. Benny Pizer is the Director of the Global Warming Policy Foundation's here in the room, and it said earlier that the growing of biofuels is amoral and unethical.
Well, I guess that's an opinion. I would argue that producing crops that may end up being refined in biorefineries, either in Europe or even in the United States, actually produces both food and fuel, because 50% of the output of most biofuel refineries in the Northern Hemisphere is high-protein animal feed, which means you have to produce less of those protein crops elsewhere in the world. At the same time, you're getting a benefit from the crop being used more efficiently, because we're in Europe here a deficit area for vegetable protein. We import 20 million tons of the stuff every year, which means that we've got to have imports, which means the crop's got to be grown elsewhere in the world. So it's a way of using our crop more efficiently, and we see no question that the part of the crop should be used for fuel, part of it for food. It's an entirely appropriate response to the market, and energy security is also important to the world as well as food security. Energy is one of the major costs in producing agricultural commodities, and perhaps the lack of availability of energy or fertilizer is one of the reasons why importing countries don't produce more of their own food.
You're shaking your head there, Dr. Peiser.
Well, none of this would happen without billions and billions of taxpayers' monies pumping into the farmers. I mean, they wouldn't do it without the subsidies. No one would grow biofuels because they only do it because governments are wasting billions on this nonsense. And obviously, there is no energy security problem either. We are flush in new unconventional gas for the next 250 years. This was concocted when this threat that we are running out of oil and we're running out of gas was hyped up. There's absolutely no indication that we're even close to a energy problem. So as far as I'm concerned, the moment the subsidies stop, no one will grow biofuels. It is an artificially subsidized policy that does not make sense environmentally, economically, or food-wise.
There are no subsidies significant subsidies in Europe or the US now. That they abandoned their subsidy policy in January this year, and the oil industry is far more subsidized than the biofuel industry. The only support is the fact that there is a small requirement, a mandate to put a certain amount of biofuel into road transport fuel.
Robert Bailey.
That's what you mean by subsidy. There aren't any cash subsidies paid to biofuel industries.
And that's a very important point. The cash subsidies have been withdrawn because national budgets have run out of money, basically. But it's not to say there aren't any subsidies. A mandate which mandates fuel blenders to put biofuels into the petrol and diesel mix is a huge subsidy to the industry because it forces consumers to buy biofuel at times when biofuels are more expensive than oil prices. It's a guarantee to the industry, and it has a very significant financial value attached to that. If you look at the IEA's modelling of how much transfers are going to go to the biofuel sector over the next sort of 10, 20, 30 years, we're looking at tens of billions of dollars a year just for the value of these mandate policies. So it's a very significant subsidy indeed.
But
at certain times in the economic cycle, I mean, there are other times in which it's a perfectly rational thing to use biofuels because they're cheaper than oil. And you could argue about why oil prices are higher, but it certainly is another way to limit the cost of energy. Because at certain times in the economic cycle it's worth putting biofuel in, and it doesn't need the mandate. And that's when, at the moment, in the US, for example, they're benefiting because when prices for grain were lower and prices for oil were high, they put a lot more ethanol into the fuel mix. Now they're benefiting because they can wind back their production of ethanol and use the certificates that will carry over from when there was a surplus to a time when there's a deficit. So you can argue,
just to reiterate,
subsidy, it's actually trying to balance out the market in a way that allows a new fledgling industry to enter the oil industry, which, as you can imagine, the oil industry are not going to be particularly supportive of any kind of competition whatsoever.
Robert Bailey, one more time and then we'll move to you, James.
This is not an infant industry. We've been subsidising biofuels since the late 1970s in the US, for example, so it's about time the infant industry grew up. And secondly, just to reiterate the point, over the cycle, there are very significant net transfers from consumers and taxpayers to the biofuel industry of the order of tens of billions of dollars a year worldwide.
Bringing it back then to the consumers and to the taxpayers, and consumers and taxpayers read newspapers, they listen to the radio, they see what's going on, they hear food security issues. There's a drought in America causing a deficit of the wheat crops, a changing westernized diet in other countries in Asia like China. What do these food security issues mean for the consumer? James?
Well, I think the important thing is if we need more food, which we do, we need more farmers. And the government policy has been for about 10 years now, has been to persuade farmers to diversify out of farming. Biofuel was one policy, organic farming was another policy. Diversification was being pushed by the Countryside Agency here because we were, or the received wisdom was that we were overproducing. Now we discover that we've gone too far. We need to produce more, not less. So I think the only way to do that is to have more farmers and more acres under the plough. And if you think about the way policy has been working in recent times, it's been about retiring land from production, where what we need to do is bring land into production.
Benny Pizer, what would you say in terms of a food industrial or an agricultural revolution? Does it need to take place?
It is taking place. It is already taking place, and it's continuously innovating, and it's continuously producing higher yields all over the world, which is why we cope with these crises better than in the past. I mean, we had a similar drought in the 1930s in the US, the Dust Bowl, which was a real economic and social upheaval. Today, the US shrugs at this, and no one really notices. Perhaps in Egypt, people notice because the price of food goes up, but the Americans are not suffering because of the drought. And the reality is that we, because of technological progress, particularly in the agricultural sector, we are coping better with environmental stresses, and we are producing crops that can cope better. And the latest developments will be drought-resistant crops for marginal areas of agricultural land that will be able to even sustain a severe drought.
A lot of this actually comes back to the point that our colleague from the National Farmers Union made earlier on in the discussion, which was the balance between public and private investment in technology. And part of the problem, I think, with GM has been that the technology development has been led early on by the private sector, which prioritised technologies which were really of fairly low value to society, things like Roundup Ready corn, which allowed farmers to just spray huge fields of corn or soy, whatever it was, and reduce some of their costs in doing that. But these weren't things that people could see had a real value to them, an intrinsic value to them. Now, I think if the public sector was to move more into this space and provide more support for technologies which could have clear health benefits, drought-resistant, saline-resistant crops, things that will be able to stand up better to climate change, then there would be a much stronger case for accepting GM to the broader public. And I think that's part of the solution to all of this, in my opinion.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. Joining me for today's discussion on food security is Robert Bailey, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House, Dr. Benny Pizer, Director of the Global Warming Policy, Guy Gajan, Chief Arable Advisor for the National Farmers Union in the UK, and journalist James Hartland, who's also a lecturer in economic regeneration. When you mentioned earlier, Benny, about the American doesn't know there's a drought, someone in Egypt does, when will it dawn on the Western world genuinely that there is a problem? When will the shopping trolley change? People realise actually there is a food shortage. Actually, this is far more expensive than I thought.
I
James?
think it's a good point that shoppers know, and we've known really since 2005 is when prices started to climb. And there was a big spike, as Benny said, in 2007, and maybe it relaxed, but prices didn't come down that much. I think it's important to see there's a problem, but it's not a massive problem. And I think certainly in the West, people are resentful, and it causes problems with the household budget, but people are not starving. So we're not going to see a kind of reaction as you would find in Egypt or in Indonesia to food security. And that's why probably we're more susceptible to anxiety about food, like anxiety about genetic modification, anxiety about organic foods. That's much more of a Western preoccupation. And we might be asking now whether we can afford some of these slightly food fussy considerations, and maybe start thinking about farmers aren't the evil demons that we thought of them, but the people that put the food on our plate.
I think you're making some interesting points there, Benny, but we ought not to be complacent. I mean, if you look at agricultural prices and you take them back, grain prices going back 1,000 years, for example, they went up and up and up every year because agriculture struggled to keep up with the technology, with the population demand. When we opened up the Midwest in the US and parts of Russia and parts of Canada and Australia in the 1850s, the prices went down, and they went down every year. The arable crop prices, so grains prices, went down every year. until about the year 2000, and since then they have been going up, like you point out. And that should be a signal to us that we shouldn't be too complacent about technology. We haven't been investing enough in technologies, and we need to do an enormous amount more. Otherwise, that position will get more and more difficult to cope with over time. Yes, there's a good track record of technology delivering enough food, but it's not working at the moment because we're not putting enough effort and resource into it.
Robert Bailey.
I just wanted to come back to your question about consumers and when consumers in developed countries are going to realise the gravity of the situation. A lot of it comes down to price. In developed countries, people typically pay about 10% of their disposable income on food. Obviously, it's more in poorer households and it's less in richer households. In developing countries, the poorest people can pay anything up from 50% of their income on food, up to 75% in some of the poorest countries. So a spike in food prices, if food prices double and you spend 50% of your income on food, suddenly you're destitute. It hits poor people much, much, much harder. If food prices double, rich consumers notice it much less, not only because they spend much less of their income on food, but they also buy processed foods where the price of the commodity makes up a much smaller component of the overall cost because of packaging and processing costs as well. So we're insulated from this in rich countries, and in a lot of ways the price of food isn't high enough for us to actually make the right kind of purchasing decisions. We throw away about 30% of the food we buy here.
James, you mentioned that it's a problem, but it's not a big problem, the food crisis, and we've got consumers who probably won't really notice, like Robert says, for years or even that much because their expenditure on food is nominal compared to, say, someone in Africa or Egypt. Do we need to change public perception on what really is food security?
I think public perception is changing, and when people are harder up, they're less concerned with the symbolic aspects of food, like is it organic, and they're more concerned with price. And of course it's true that better off people aren't preoccupied with those things, but the mass of the population will follow the price and they will buy cheap.
And Guy Gagan from the NFU, final word from you, please. What would you like to see from farmers and their response to the food security issues facing the world?
Well, I think farmers around the world have got an opportunity to produce an enormous amount more food, and if they don't, if we don't get food to the populations where it's needed, they're going to start moving to the places where the food is produced. So it becomes a problem for everybody over the next sort of 40 or 50 years if we don't do something about it. We need to get more investment in technology.
I'd like to thank all my guests. Robert Bailey, Senior Research Fellow at Chatham House, Dr. Benny Pizer, Director of the Global Warming Policy Foundation, James Hartland, Lecturer in Economic Regeneration, and Guy Gagan, Chief Arable Advisor for the National Farmers Union. Policy Foundation, and James Hartfield, a lecturer and journalist in economic regeneration. And on the telephone, Guy Gagan, the Chief Arable Advisor for the National Farmers Union in the UK. James Hartfield, start with you. You've been writing about the environment for many years. What picture would you paint of the current situation?
It's obviously a problem in America, and the United Nations have made this warning, so we should take it seriously. I think the broad picture is not a disaster, or shouldn't be a disaster. However, we have to get used to the idea that particularly China and
the EU. But what we're not seeing is production keeping pace with it. So globally, cereal yields have started to flatline despite the fact that demand is continuing to increase. So this means that markets are very tightly balanced, prices get very volatile in these situations, and stocks, the amount of food that we're keeping in reserve, they are now very low. So we don't have the stocks up our sleeves to dip into when we see a significant shock, such as the drought that we're seeing in the US at the moment. So at the moment, we're in a situation where we can expect food prices
and is warning against panic buying and restrictions on exports. It added that world cereal stocks would fall sharply, down 6% from its July forecast. Earlier today, Russian Deputy Agricultural Minister Ilya Shestakov said G20 countries would hold a rapid response meeting on the grain market next month. So, is the world on the brink of a new global food crisis? And what will the impact be if the cost of food continues to rise? Joining me in the studio is Robert Bailey, a Senior Research Fellow, Energy, Environment and Resources at Chatham House. Dr. Benny Pizer, Director of the Global Warming.
India have moved their economies away from agriculture towards industry, and that will put a greater demand on food worldwide.
Robert Bailey, you're from Chatham House. What would you say is the current picture of the world food industry, and what crisis does it face?
Well, we're currently in a period of very tightly balanced supply and demand. As we've just heard, demand is continually increasing, primarily due to economic development in emerging economies and the increasing use of biofuels, particularly in the US.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London with me, Juliet Spare. The worst drought in America for more than half a century and poor crops from the Black Sea breadbasket have both sent grain prices to record highs, raising the alarm over a potential repeat of the 2007-8 food crisis. The UN Food and Agricultural Organization is urging countries now to review their biofuel mandates